Sometimes, the most surprising stories in the world are actually the ones that look really simple at first. But when you take a closer look, you realize there's a whole system working behind the scenes. Think about this for a second. Imagine a country that produces more oil than any other country in the world. Every single day, millions of barrels of oil are pumped out of the ground. The technology is incredibly advanced. In just a few years, this country became one of the biggest energy producers on the planet. And yet, there's something strange. That same country still imports oil from other countries every year. At first, that sounds a little confusing. I mean, if a country already produces more oil than anyone else, why would it still need to buy oil from somewhere else? It feels like something doesn't add up. But the answer isn't as simple as it seems, because the global energy system isn't just about how much oil a country produces. There's science involved, there's technology, there's infrastructure, and sometimes even old laws that still affect how things work today. Once you start looking at all those pieces together, the picture starts to make a lot more sense. So let's start with something really basic. Not all oil is the same. A lot of people assume oil is just oil. But in reality, the crude oil that comes out of the ground can be very different depending on where it comes from. In the oil industry, crude oil is usually divided into two main types: light crude and heavy crude. Light crude oil is thinner, it flows more easily, and it usually contains less sulfur. Because of that, it's easier to refine, and it works really well for producing fuels like gasoline and diesel. Heavy crude oil is different. It's thicker, heavier, and harder to process. Refineries need more complex equipment to turn it into useful fuels. And this is where the story starts to get interesting. Over the last 10 to 15 years, a huge amount of new oil production in the United States has come from shale formations. You've probably heard of this before: shale oil. New technologies like hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling made it possible to extract oil from places that used to be extremely difficult to reach. States like Texas and North Dakota became the center of this energy boom. But here's the important part. Most shale oil is light crude oil, and that creates an interesting situation. You see, many of the refineries in the United States were originally designed to process heavy crude oil. Those refineries were built decades ago, when the US was importing a lot of heavy oil from places like Mexico, Venezuela, and parts of the Middle East. So the infrastructure, the actual refining equipment, was optimized for heavier oil. Now you might think, okay, so why not just switch the refineries to light crude? Well, that's easier said than done. Upgrading a refinery is incredibly expensive. We're talking billions of dollars, and sometimes years of construction and redesign. So energy companies often make decisions based on what makes the most economic sense. If they can sell their light crude oil on the global market and then import the kind of oil that works better in their refineries, financially, that can actually be the smarter move. That's why the global oil market often works a bit like an exchange system. Countries don't just buy oil, they buy the type of oil that fits their infrastructure best. But that's only part of the story. Geography also plays a big role. The United States is a huge country. The places where oil is produced and the places where fuel is used aren't always the same. For example, Texas and the Gulf Coast are some of the most active oil-producing regions in the world. Massive amounts of crude oil are produced there every day. But the demand for fuel isn't limited to those areas. The East Coast and the West Coast also have enormous populations and industries that need energy. In a perfect world, pipelines would move oil easily from one region to another, but the real world isn't perfect. Some areas have limited pipelines. Sometimes environmental concerns slow down new projects. Sometimes there are land disputes, and sometimes regulatory approvals take years. Because of all that, moving oil across the country can occasionally become very expensive. And when companies run the numbers, they sometimes realize something surprising. Importing oil by ship can actually be cheaper than transporting domestic oil across the country. There's also another factor that many people don't know about. Back in 1920, the United States passed a law called the Jones Act. According to this law, if cargo is transported between two U.S. ports, it has to be carried on ships that are built in the U.S., registered in the U.S., and operated by American crews. The original goal was national security. The idea was to make sure the country would always have its own merchant fleet available during emergencies. But over time, it also had economic consequences. Ships built in the United States tend to be more expensive than ships built in many other countries. Because of that, there are fewer of them and they cost more to operate. So sometimes, moving oil from one U.S. port to another by ship becomes very expensive. And that's when the situation starts to look a little strange. On one hand, oil is being produced inside the country, and on the other, oil is also arriving by ship from overseas. From the outside, the system can look messy, even illogical. But once you look at the science, the engineering, the infrastructure, and the economics behind it, you realize something important. The global economy runs on an incredibly complex network. Decisions aren't made simply based on where a resource exists. They depend on what technology allows, what infrastructure supports, and what option is the most efficient overall. That's why global energy markets rarely tell a simple story. There are always layers, and behind each layer, there's another reason. And once you start understanding those layers, you realize something interesting. The world is often a lot more complicated than it looks from the outside.